بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الواحد الأحد الفرد الصمد الذي لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد يا من أرسل الرسل مبشرين ومنذرين وجعل دين الحنفاء دينا قيما واختص ملة الإبراهيم الحنيف بال- بالكرامة والتشريف وما جعل علينا في الدين من حرج ولكن جعلنا أمة وسطا لنكون شهداء على الناس. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد خاتم النبيين وإمام المرسلين الذي أحيا ملة الحنفاء وأقام البرهان على صدق دعوة إبراهيم الحنيف وأكمل به الدين وأتم به النعمة ورضي لنا الإسلام دينا. اللهم لك الحمد والشكر على نعمة الشريعة الغراء التي بينها على لسان نبيك المصطفى وفهمه للعلماء الأجلاء من الأئمة الهدى ومصابيح الدجى كأبي حنيفة النعمان ومالك بن إمام دار الهجرة وشافعي المطلبي وأحمد بن حنبل الشيباني ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين لمن صار على نهجة الحنفاء واتبع السبيل المهتدي. جزاكم الله خير جزاء for all of you for joining us. I would first of all thank Sayyidi Sheikhna Tabriz for actually inviting me to accepting my invitation to do this, to be honest, because I know we would like to sort of kick off because we don't have really much time. But this was, as you said earlier on, going to be part of the journal. So the Hanafi journal, Hanafi Studies journal, بإذن al-Karim Bari. And what we have been very unfortunate with is getting my piece ready and out. So I thought I'll use this opportunity, inshallah, to sort of brainstorm, have a bit of discussion around it, and get a feedback, because at the end of the day, I am not formally studied, so I haven't formally studied the Hanafi madhab. Although I'm just looking at this from the perspective of historical analysis and historical legacy, and not necessarily discussing in depth the Masail fiqh. So, inshallah, this should suffice for us, bi'inillah al-Kareem. And then I hope you guys can, udran, forgive me for any mistakes I make in the process of this, but also help me with it, bi'inillah al-Kareem al-Bari. I just want to also recognize that this is part of a book that I've been compiling for the past few years, a chapter of a book which was called Islamic Seminaries in History of Islamic Seminaries in the Horn of Africa. And this was designed to basically study how Islam came to the Horn of Africa, spread, and how the ulama have advanced the Islamic studies themselves and the seminaries that popped up in the Horn of Africa, but also outside of Horn of Africa. So those scholars who went abroad, bi'inillah. So having said that, I just want to sort of kick off with the session, and I'll be fast forwarding quite a few a bit, which is basically the introduction to historical analysis of the early periods, so that we can get a bit of idea. So this paper, or this, how do you say, this presentation falls into those three parts that you see at. So it's part one, we're talking about a little bit quickly on those who are not really familiar with exactly where the Horn of Africa is, or specifically what the Horn of Africa is. Those ethnicities and that we find in the Horn of Africa, especially the nisbah that they are attributed with in the books that we see in Islamic studies and in the tabaqat, and then also the sources we used to study this or to bring about this piece. And then the second part talks about the spread of Hanafism in Africa, essentially, and the spread of Hanafism in the Horn of Africa specifically, and then the Hanafi dynasties of the Horn and Yemen. And we mention Yemen and why in a minute, and we will explain that in the relevant part. It's really important that we know why Yemen is involved with the Horn of Africa, because you might be thinking, okay, that's across the Red Sea, so that's not part of the African continent. But culturally, linguistically, and a lot of Islamic interaction, that part of the world is very important to the Horn of Africa. And then you have Hanafi seminaries in the Horn, the places that sort of became the critical localities where Hanafi fiqh has been studied, and the ulama that we came to know down the line came from. And then the influential Hanafis from the Horn, and I will mention as a case study in depth two specific Hanafis. There is so many that I could go into, and I think maybe if Sayyidi Shaykhna Tabriz will have me again, we could do this another session being like on some of those other scholars that we can get down the line. And then Hanafi texts in the Horn and their rich literature and the heritage of that. And so, having said that, we're going to go to the next slide. So just quick overview in terms of Horn of Africa. When we look at the Islamic literature, Horn of Africa is considered as Ard Sudan sometimes. It's sometimes known as Habasha or Barabar. Has names such as Jabert, it has names such as al-Zaylaʿī and more, and we will see down the line. And so it consists, basically, it's a very large land piece that consists modern day Ethiopia, Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, and those part of lands, the countries that surround it. And sometimes as a greater Horn, it's added Kenya, Uganda, Sudan, and South Sudan. And that is basically because of you can't differentiate, you can't put how do you say, superficial line on a map and then expect people and cultures who speak similar language, have similar cultures, to be divided by superficial maps. So anyway, that is what we know as the Horn of Africa. And therefore, we just quickly get into part one and look at where is the Horn of Africa. The Horn of Africa, obviously, as you can see, as we said, is a very large part of the African continent, and also known as the Northeast Africa. It's known by a variety of names in the literature, in the Arabic literature and the tabaqat. They call it sometimes the Swahili coast, they call it Ard al-Sunuj, or they call it sometimes even the Sahel or the Sawahil. Further south than that, they call it sometimes Ard al-Waqwaq. And so if you could see, come across these terminologies, which are very elaborate and long and sometimes very confusing, you just need to have a little bit of patience in decoding many of these things. So what are the ethnicities that we come across in the Horn of Africa? And the Horn of Africa encompasses a sort of diverse ethnicities and cultures. And so that can be seen through those terminologies that you see now on the screen. Ard Sudan, you come across a lot of the terminologies Habashi or Habashis. And that's why I keep using the word Horn of Africa, because it's the equivalent of Ard Sudan, it's the equivalent of Habashi, because in early period, when they were writing these names, a lot of it was a matter of copy and paste. The geographical studies that were done were based on what somebody else wrote, and so they would copy and paste on those type of things, unless people were geographers themselves who traveled to these places or directly interviewed and talked to people who came from these places, which are very rare, by the way. And we will talk about some of them down the line as we were discussing some of the Hanafis that come from these parts of the world. Okay, what sources are used mainly and why? The tabaqat literature are really, really important. I've been in love and passionate about the tabaqat literature, subhanAllah. The tabaqat literature are so out there when it comes to rich material on not only names, places people have traveled to, where they studied, where they came from, their cultures and stuff, but also that link of the ulama, that link of Islamic literature, Islamic heritage, and Islamic adab, Islamic learning. So that link and the piety that connects them all is found in the tabaqat literature. And so that alone is amazing resources when you get one individual whose biography is very briefly talked about, and then you go to another biographers, and then you find extra details, and then you go to another biographer, you find a little bit more extra details, and then so on and so on, and you could get a beautiful material out of that, which is really unfortunately not studied enough. And so if you look at the broader society role of Islamic institutions, you can even understand quickly, and look at the tabaqat, you can really quickly understand that a lot of the ulama traveled up and down. And here there's a quote on the screen by al-Janadi in his al-Suluk في طبقات العلماء, and he mentions one of the ulama called Ahmed ibn Muhammad, that he traveled to Habasha, and then many people have taken the madhab from him in that regard. The madhab here is the Hanafi madhab, and they basically spread the Hanafi madhab extensively. And so that's an example of one person story just casually being just reduced to one line, and sometimes even more better than that. But you will see down the line why that is the case being the Karim Bari. So part two, we're talking about the spread of Hanafism. And the spread of Hanafism basically entails that basically Hanafism in early period, during the time of Imam Abu Hanifa, rahmatullahi alayh, we know that many students have taken knowledge from him from all corners of the world, because the Kufa and generally Baghdad, where they basically was the center of Imam Abu Hanifa and his students and the madhab. Many scholars from around the world came to study with him and others, and they took these afkar, or these opinions and these views, and they took them back to their mother countries or the localities. And so we know one of those earliest places is in North Africa, that many of these ulama have actually traveled back to, and then they spread in Tunisia, for example, in this case, the case of by Abu Muhammad Abdullah ibn Farrukh, who was a student both of Imam Hanifa and Imam Malik. He was known as a Maliki, but he was also one of those crucial people who actually spread Hanafism in North Africa. And then we have an amazing quote that has been used frequently by Imam al-Qadi al-Iyad, rahmatullahi alayh, who mentions that when the ashab or the imams of Abu Hanifa entered in North Africa, or Ifriqiya as was known as Maghrib, and the dominant school those period were actually the Hanafis, or the Kufans as they were known as. And then until he mentions Ali ibn Ziyad and Ibn Asharas and Buhlul and Ibn al-Rashid, they all entered, who were predominantly known to be spreading the Maliki madhab, but also have studied extensively the Hanafi madhab as well. And these people actually adapted it and continued to spread until Sahnun was introduced to the scene and became the prominent school of thought. So that's why we see Maliki madhab very strong in North Africa, because prior to that, Hanafism were very strong and was the center of it, and it was made possible by Hanafis. So this was made actually possible by Hanafis. And it mentions again Qadi Iyad, and that because of the jurists of at the time of the fuqaha of Kufa, or the Kufiyin, were the dominant scholars, and they have actually chosen that the first Qadi al-Quddat to be chosen among the Malikis will be Sahnun. And this is one of the first times that we actually get and realize that the strength that Hanafis had in terms of as a madhab over there, and the way they spread even other madahibs and openness to other madahibs, and of course can be seen through that example of promoting Maliki madhab beside the Hanafi madhab. So that is a practical lesson that we can see, and this is a matter that has been reproduced by historians and scholars of the Maliki madhab various times, such as Qadi Iyad, as well as Qadi Ibn al-Arabi, and I've mentioned this. And so when did Hanafism then come to the fore? Initially, Hanafism was introduced into Maghrib, and then it was introduced in Qahira and Cairo and these areas, and then it was also introduced in the Horn of Africa. We don't know exactly at what point the Hanafi madhab was introduced, but we do know at what point it was very popular, and we know this through the anecdotes and the tabaqat literature, as well as the Muslim dynasties that resided in the Horn of Africa, who were Hanafis predominantly themselves. And some of the reasons has been mentioned is because of trade networks, and because a lot of the scholars were trading or migrating sometimes, or actually moving to other places, or even the allure of actually getting a new and right dynasty to actually fund your teaching or fund your madrasa, because that is what used to happen a lot. The leaders, the polity would fund a lot of money towards making possible that vibrant and intellectual scholars actually came. So they attracted vibrant and intellectual scholars, and then they would pay institutions and they would give them official positions in that regard. And so that's really important for us to look and understand. Bismillah. Bismillah. And then so going further, Hanafism arrived also in Yemen early as the second or the 8th century Hijri, during the 3rd Abbasid Caliph of al-Mahdi, and later on the 5th Abbasid Caliph, his son Harun al-Rashid. And this is the fact because that madhab, as it was very popular during the Abbasid period, it was also very popular that the Qadi of Yemen would be Hanafi, and that would have been allocated by the Abbasid Caliph in what was Baghdad at the time, and later on what Harun al-Rashid moved the capital towards, where was it that he moved to? He moved it basically to Persia. I forgot the locality exactly, but anyway, so this is becomes the Hanafi madhab becomes essentially, and the Qadi gets introduced essentially to Yemen, and thus Hanafi just took over Yemen mostly, and then Hanafi jurisprudence remained and dominant in Yemen for a long time. It has been the view that for many times that Hanafi madhab in Yemen was very latecomer and was quickly replaced by the Shafi'i madhab, as we see today. That is not the case. The Hanafi madhab stayed prominent through the effort, not only through the effort of these scholars from the Horn, but also through the effort of Yemeni scholars that produced a lot of Hanafi literature. And we will come to understand what these are in a minute. So Hanafism in the Horn of Africa via Yemen. Among the famous Hanafi books that was very popular in Yemen, and by extension also very much introduced into the Horn of Africa, was the title called Al-Qadi by the judge Muhammad ibn Abi Auf. He was very known scholar among the Hanafis in Iraq and Yemen. That title was very much known in Iraq and Yemen. One of the scholars and who wrote his biography says that Al-Qadi, that kitab, was very popular by the Hanafis in Yemen and Iraq and in Shām, just like al-Muhaddab became very popular with the Shafi'is. And the Shafi'is Muhaddab is very, very strong book, which eventually became the Majmu' al-Sharh al-Muhaddab of Imam Nawawi later on. And so many madāris specialized in teaching Hanafi schools, and they came to exist. Rulers would host debates on fiqh masail, and this became actually a dominant thing throughout the Muslim world, that, to basically, throughout Yemen and the Horn, and we will talk about that soon as well. And then, scholars would actually come and sort of finesse, as it were, and show their skills in terms of debating, in terms of knowing the masail, in terms of making sure that people actually knew their fiqh. So debating between Hanafis and Shafi'is was very popular in Yemen, but also very popular in the Horn. There is a case of in the 12th century CE, which is around about 6th century Hijri, in Bali Sultanate, which we'll talk about down the line, that the great saint and Shafi'i jurist Shaykh Nur al-Hussein debated against Hanafis on the issues of Naveed, and is a popular debate that has been documented, and a discussion that came to exist, and is very anecdotally interesting, because they're debating on Naveed, But then one of the things that was very popular with the people was the chewing of taqat or these things. And so the discussion of that being haram and halal was not being debated, but that was being debated, whereas the Shafi'is didn't consider that haram at the time. And so it's very loosely, you could say, the discussion sort of and the vibrant debate actually made sure that people actually could understand what Hanafism is, what Shafi'ism is, and then people took these madahibs accordingly. And so we're talking about now here the polity in the Horn of Africa who were generally Hanafis and who were known to follow Hanafi madhab. And this is very interesting because at the end of the day, the best anecdotal that we have, or the best evidence that we have in terms of knowing Hanafi madhab and the effect Hanafi madhab had, the effect Hanafi madhab had on the Horn of Africa and how strong and vibrant Hanafi madhab had, comes through actually looking at these dynasties that ruled. So Ibn Fadlallah al-Umari, who was alive in the 740s, Hijri, 1340s, who wrote this amazing monumental work called Masalik al-Absar fi Mamalik al-Absar, which is around 27 volumes for those of you who are not familiar with it, which is a geographical as well as a dictionary of Islamic dynasties in the world at the time. He dedicates a chapter to the Horn of Africa. And the dynasties that he specifically categorizes and lists are essentially 7, but there are more than 7. But the headlines of those dynasties that he gives us as 7, that there are more. So he lists other dynasties that are there in the Horn of Africa as part of the evidence. And so he mentions, except for Ifat, that most of it, that's why you see SH next to Ifat, everybody else is an Hanafi. So every sultanate and dynasty is officially following the Hanafi madhab, meaning the Qadi al-Qudat, the judges based on the Hanafi code of law, according to Imam Abu Hanifa, the Kufan madhab. And so this shows you immediately that Northeast Africa, or the Horn of Africa, specifically what is today modern-day Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, as well as North Ethiopia, all of these areas were following the Hanafi madhab. And this is not something that was just a unique thing at the time, because if you look at, and I just want to stand still a little bit on this issue, if you look at Ibn Fadlallah al-Umari's, what makes his narrative very important is he interviewed scholars that came from there. He interviewed scholars that came from the Horn of Africa. He was familiar with scholars that came from Horn of Africa. He was friends with them. He's actually the first person who to write a biography of Imam Fakhr al-Dīn, ዑثمان al-Zaylaʿī, who wrote the Sharh of Kanz al-Daqā'iq, known as Tabyin al-Haqā'iq. So he's actually essentially the first person, if we want to follow chronologically the people who wrote biographies on Fakhr al-Dīn al-Zaylaʿī. He's the first person, and he came from the Horn of Africa. And he's also the first person to write about the people that he interviewed, well, one of them being ʿAbdallah, ʿAbdallah ibn Yūsuf al-Zaylaʿī. Now, many times, what historians, contemporary historians, and more recent editors of this book have noted in the footnotes is to say that the Zaylaʿī that is being mentioned, Jamāl al-Dīn Zaylaʿī, that forms the narrative here that forms as a source for Ibn Fadlallah al-Umari, is the Jamāl al-Dīn Zaylaʿī, who wrote the famed hadith work on the hadith takhrij, Nasb al-Raya, Nasb al-Raya fi takhrij al-hadith al-Hidayah of Jamāl al-Dīn Zaylaʿī, which in our session another time, bi'idhnillah, we will discuss how that would not be possible simply looking at the facts on the ground, because that just having similar name individual being in coming from Zaylaʿ and being in Cairo does not necessarily mean that it's that person. So it's not like there were so many scholars that Hanafi background that came from the Horn and settled in Cairo and were teaching that were just Jamāl al-Zaylaʿī by that name. So then moving on, al-Qashqashandi, who almost a century later writes exactly verbatim what al-Umari wrote. Similarly, al-Maghrizi, who writes also about a half a century later to al-Qashqashandi. Both of these scholars, historians, continue to write and add on that these kingdoms and other kingdoms were following the Hanafi madhab. And so that tells you the strength of the Hanafi madhab, the vibrance of the Hanafi madhab to have existed there. And so the Hanafi madhab basically was also followed in Mogadishu, which was part of the Indian Ocean, Shafi'i Rim. And this is something that we know today as a sort of a factual thing that, you know, at the end of the day, the Shafi'is essentially are to be found in what is today Mogadishu. But that is not the case, or have not been always the case. And so that is something really to ponder about and see, because we know that there was an Hanafis that was stationed, and then there was a masjid / a madrasa, a seminary that was available in Mogadishu during the early period, and then where Hanafi madhab was being taught and spread. So just moving on from that. And so we're talking about Hanafi dynasties, continuing on that. And so we dating the some of these dynasties, for example, we have the Shām dynasty, which was one of the earliest dynasties of Muslim dynasties to be dated in the Horn of Africa. It sort of starts on the 3rd century / 9th century Hijri CE. And so that could be seen as a dynasty that was available and there, and the Qadi al-Quttād was actually the Hanafi scholar. And so it's very early on, around 3rd, 4th century Hijri, we can see that the Hanafis and the earliest Muslim dynasties that we have on record were following the Hanafi madhab. But following on from that, in the similar timeline, in a similar period, we have a dynasty and a kingdom that predominantly was ruled and consisted of from polity that came from the Horn of Africa, was the Banu Najah. And I want to stand still on the Banu Najah here a little bit, because the Banu Najah in Yemen are essentially the who's and who's of Yemen at that time period, because they were in conflict with the Shi'i Ismailis, who had a Khalif assistance in the Fatimid dynasty, Fatimid Caliph in Cairo, whereas the Banu Najah sought allegiance with the Abbasid dynasties in Baghdad. And so because of that, they became the dominant rulers in the Tihama region, the lower lands of what is Yemen. So the Banu Najah capital became Sabit around 412 Hijri, to basically, which was the 10th, it's sort of early 11th century CE, until 553, lasting almost a century and a half. And political and religious Banu Najah were really rivals with this polity, the Shi'i polity that basically came to replace them a couple of times here and there. And Yemen witnessed really prosperity under the Banu Najah through agriculture, land and sea, and that connection that they had with Iraq and other places. And so we know that Banu Najah rulers and ministers were really keen in spreading the deen and building madāris and financing madāris. And they did this in the hope that the Sunni madāris and the Sunni view transcends the popular Shi'i view that was available at that time period in what was the Tihama region. And they quickly replaced that through Hanafism, essentially, and then also later on added to Shafi'ism. So the Banu Najah, they acquired honorifics from the Abbasid Khalif, Abu al-Abbas, Ahmed ibn Ishaq, al-Qadir Billah, and al-Qadir Billah was himself a scholar, refined scholar of fiqh, who wrote actually quite a few books on on fiqh, and is very popular. And he organized debates as well. And so this was some of those things that transcends the party line that we sometimes come to understand of what madhab is, that negative connotation that we come up with. And so the Caliph gave Najah a title called the Nasir al-Dīn, because he considered him that, he was the person who assisted and aided the Deen, and therefore became the champion of Sunnism in the Tahamul regions and through the form of Hanafism and Shafi'ism. And so the Banu Jah extensively recruited and also sometimes themselves during their conflict with the Zaylaʿī dynasty retreated themselves to the Dahlak Islands. And the Dahlak Islands are part of Eritrea today in terms of the geographical landscape. And so therefore, whenever they were there, they would actually learn and teach and become part of these ulama. And then actually some of these rulers themselves became ulama, and they became known as the scholars of the ruling scholars themselves. So Nasiruddin's and Najah, for example, sons and inheritors would be studying the Quran and adab, Dahlak. So it's one of those things that they did actually during the period that they find themselves in the Dahlak Islands. And Manallah al-Fatiki was also very close with scholars and students, specifically the Shafi'is and Hanafis, and which reached, they say, new heights as never before, because basically he made sure that he donated, that he spread, that he influenced, and that he actually financed the scholars in whatever they needed. Okay, so Hanafism in the Horn through the period of the Rasulid then actually becomes a really tangible evidence that Hanafism is not really reduced, because several historians nowadays have this view that Hanafism gets reduced through the Rasulid dynasty, because Rasulid dynasties become predominantly Shafi'is themselves. But there were the Banu Rasul were part of those dynasties, the Sunni, who champions basically the Shafi'i and Hanafi madhab, but specifically early on the Hanafi madhab. So by the time the Rasulid dynasty came, Hanafi madhab was very well accepted as part of the landscape, and many of these themselves were Hanafis, and al-Jannadi and al-Ahdal ascribed this Hanafism identity to a specific scholar that was known as Muhammad ibn Ibrahim al-Zaylaʿī, whose grandfather was also a local jurist known as ʿAlī ibn Abi Bakr, ʿAlī ibn Abi Bakr bin Muhammad al-Zaylaʿī, sorry, his grandson. And so these two became predominantly the face of Hanafism in Yemen. And they came from Zayla. They originally hailed from Zayla, and they were known. And if you look at that time period and you assess through the tabaqats across the board, one of the anecdotes that you come across frequently is that these Hanafis were culturally Hanafis. So they would say, they were Hanafis by name, but not by the layman I'm talking about, but not by study. But eventually, people came to know Hanafism only through these scholars and their teachers and their teaching. Sorry, apologies. And so the madhab in the Tahama spread through these Zaylaʿī scholars, especially this line of Muhammad ibn Ibrahim al-Zaylaʿī and his sons and his grandsons, who became known as the scholars. And so Ali ibn Abi Bakr, Muhammad al-Zaylaʿī, he died and was buried in Mecca. He was a very popular scholar. As-Sakhawi tells us that when he died in Mecca, many people who actually came to Mecca, specifically scholars, they sought to be buried next to him, seeking that proximity with him in the grave, because of obviously they wanted to associate with him. And so they also tell us in the biographers that these scholars from Zayla came from specifically a town known as Bitta or Bitta. And this is not known where exactly it is or where it's located today. There are ideas on where it is in the Horn of Africa, but it's not specifically pinpointed. But this is, once more, a town or locality, a seminary, because you have to remember many of these places that came to be known by as a nisba, came to be known as not only trading centers, but also centers of Islamic studies. So a lot of these ulama would come from different centers or different towns, and these different towns and places became the seminaries, the Islamic seminaries that were very popular with them. And so many of these ulama would actually hail from these seminary towns, as there were. And so they tell us again and again that these fuqaha and these zuhad and these people were actually sought after, and people would move into these towns, and these towns essentially started as a seminaries and grew up to be vibrant towns where trading and cultural exchange was very popular. And so moving on, this is the section I really want to stand still on Hanafism from the Horn. As we said, we're going to be focusing on some of these scholars that have existed in that time period. I'm just trying to get up some details here. But yeah, so in terms of the Hanafi seminaries in the Horn of Africa, we have quite a few, we have quite a few place names that pop up in the tabaqat literature, historical literature. And the ulama and these people who wrote this tabaqat literature, they sometimes go into detail with this where these places are, how it's pronounced, where it's located, who is from there, why it's so popular with certain group of people, such as, this literature that scholars have built in terms of their dictionaries on names and place names that the ulama had, because it's very confusing. If you've ever read a decent amount of tabaqat literature, you will come across so much material. It just expands your head. And so it's very hard to connect the dots on where these places are. But sometimes, though, what happens as a consequence is that some of the scholars, basically, they make a mistake in thinking that, that the location is there, or that town name is there. So sometimes in error, sometimes in what they consider themselves to be appropriate conclusion, which is not the case. So you can see that through Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani's work a couple of times here and there, where he mentions these localities, but he puts them in geographically different places, which are not the case. So we look at Rouen, for example. Rouen is one of those amazing places where Hanafi scholars came from. Really very, very vibrant Hanafi scholars came from, and then they traveled around the world. They traveled to Yemen, they traveled to Shām, they traveled to Hijaz, they traveled to Cairo, and many others also have traveled towards the Indian Ocean, towards the Asia. And so you would see that Rouen, or Rourat, as is known as in these biographical dictionaries, is repeated frequently in these dictionaries. Similar thing is Bitta, as we mentioned earlier on, is Hanafi seminary of the Horn. Same thing with Jidāʿī or Gidaya, which is still today to be found in Ethiopia. You can actually look that up. And it's also found in the literature across the historical literature that we have available to us. You can see that. So one of the scholars that came from there was Muhammad ibn Ali ibn Abu Bakr, Ali al-Jidda'i, who was also a Hanafi scholar, who died in 723, but his expertise and famed expertise, it wasn't fiqh, although he was an Hanafi scholar, but his expertise actually lay in the Quranic recitations. So he was a Qari, he was known as a person who specialized in the Quran, and people came actually to study with him in many places, specifically in Shām. And you have Duwan, for example, seminary, you have Jabert seminary, you have Zaylaʿī, as we mentioned, you have Dahlak, you have many places like that which at the moment I'm not going to detail the description on. I want to start with a case study that we're going to really stand still on, which is Imam Muwafaq al-Dīn Ali ibn al-Nuh. Ali ibn al-Nuh is one of those great Hanafi scholars that probably for the most of you, and I'm here actually assuming a lot, not familiar with, but he's one of those silent individuals throughout history who've influenced Hanafism in not only in the Horn of Africa, but also in Yemen, and Yemeni scholars in large. And not many people know about him. He's basically famed students traveled all around the world. He taught all around the Muslim world. And he traveled from Zaylaʿ. And one of those things that is amazing, and specifically that I choose to take the anecdotes of or the analyze, is scholars who actually graduated in their locality. So scholars who actually graduated from their locality and then traveled places like Yemen and other places to learn even further or teach and spread whatever they have learned. And so that is what I'm focusing on. There are many people, individuals, who are actually born in different parts of the world as a diasporan Hanafi scholars of the Horn. I have not chosen those people. I've chosen people who actually studied in their locality and advanced. And so he's been said that his lineage originally traced to Ubay ibn Abi Ka'b, but those are some of these lineages that people have asserted for themselves. You see a lot of Aqilis in the Horn of Africa. But so he's one of those people who are known as Ubawi, which is modern day roughly found in Afar country, which is between Djibouti and between Djibouti and Eritrea, those type of area, and Ethiopia, the triangle that's known as the Afar Triangle. So he might have been an Afar, Allahu Alam, but he might have been another from the other ethnic groups of the Horn of Africa. So he was an Hadith and Hanafi fiqh scholar. He left the Horn of Africa, Zaylaʿ, in the Hajj season towards Mecca as a celebrated scholar. And then on his way to Hajj, he came across Imam al-Siraj Abu Bakr ibn Ali ibn Musa al-Humrani or al-Hamili, very famous Hanafi scholar, Hanafi teacher and Hanafi writer who wrote a lot of works on Hanafi fiqh. He became his companion, and as many others have done during that period. And so if you look at that time period, you will find that Humrani was very influential in teaching and spreading the Hanafi madhab and also writing it. And so he was a companion, and actually al-Humrani was himself also a student of Muwafaq al-Dīn, and Muwafaq al-Dīn was also a student of Humrani. So you have to look at it from that perspective as well, so that you kind of understand. So Muwafaq al-Dīn Ali ibn al-Nuh studied following works, refined the following works with Sirajuddin Abu Bakr in the works that are listed here, that you can see is briefly known as Arjuzat al-Hamili or Mandumat al-Hamiliya. And he also wrote Sharh Mukhtasar Quduri fi Fiqh al-Hanafi, and that specific sharh would be later on very influential for one of the critical students of both of Humrani and Muwafaq al-Dīn to come later. And so Muwafaq al-Dīn later on moved to Al-Salama with the great Hanafi scholars from Zaylaʿ, who were named ʿAlī al-Zaylaʿī for a period of time. The same ʿAlī al-Zaylaʿī that we were just talking about earlier on. So he moved to Salama, and this was a center of Hanafi studies, predominantly from the Hanafis of the Horn of Africa. And this was that locality and other localities such as Zrid had a specific madrasa dedicated to teaching Hanafi madhab, such as Madrasat al-Mansuriyya al-Hanafiyya, which was specializing in Hanafi madhab. So coming back to the Sharh Mukhtasar al-Quduri of let me go back to it. Sharh Mukhtasar Quduri bi Fiqh al-Hanafi. Later on, this sharh and and his work would be taken by one of the students of both Hamili and Muwaffaq and then would become al-Jawharat al-Nayyira or Niyyira, if I'm not mistaken. Sheikh Tabriz can correct me later on, being al-Karim. And then so that volume that's very famous within the Hanafis by Al-Haddad would incorporate the views and the fiqh views and issues that was discussed by these two great scholars down the line. Although specifically I've not been able to allocate the attribution of both of these scholars in those works. However, we have in the Hashiyah of Radd al-Muhtar by Ibn Abd-Din, who later on mentions that actually those quotes and those views and opinions are actually quoted from Siraj al-Din and Muwaffaq al-Din, who both basically quote one another. And so Madrasat al-Muslimin Hanafi had impressive list of teachers during the 5th Rasulid dynasty. Al-Malik al-Mujahid Ali ibn Abi Dawood, who died 721, and Muwaffaq al-Din, our scholar here, prospered a lot and had at least some contact with him, and he used to attend in his court, specifically with his friend and colleague and teacher ʿAlī al-Zaylaʿī that we were just talking about earlier. The specific sultan we've mentioned earlier on came from also a scholarly background, specifically a lady that really loved ulama and scholarship by the name of Jihad Salah. Apologies. And she was very influential. She came from a household of ulama herself, and she donated a lot and paid towards the scholarly teaching. She paid as a waqaf. She set up some waqaf, a patron of several madāris, some of which were Hanafis in Yemen, and she was very close with Ali ibn Abi Bakr Muhammad al-Zaylaʿī and Muwaffaq al-Din, and who's frequently attended with her, as well as her son, the Sultan, that we were just talking about, al-Malik al-Mujahid, who was known as a great alim himself, al-Mujahid, the Rasulid dynasty. He was an alim, an expert in various sciences of Islam, and he taught a lot, and he wrote a lot. So Muwaffaq al-Din Ali ibn Nuh was also the Imam of Masjid al-Ash'ari, which is very popular with Hanafis from the Horn as well. And he led there, and people actually came to study with him. Some of his popular students are listed below. And one of the scholars that we really want to stand still on, as we mentioned here, is one of them, if you just quickly go through, is Fakhr Ali ibn Ḥuthmān al-Khatib, Taqi-ud-Din Umar ibn ʿAbdallah al-Makki, Afif al-Din Ḥuthmān ibn Qasim al-Qurtubi, not Qurtubi to be confused of Qurtuba, but Qurtubi with a ta, which is in modern-day Yemen, Al-Qadi Jamāl al-Din Muhammad ibn Ibrahim al-Jallād, and then you have Radiuddin Abu Bakr ibn Ali ibn Muhammad al-Haddad, who basically would incorporate later on the views of what he learned from Muwaffaq al-Din as well as al-Hamili. And this is the statement, as we were saying earlier on, by Ibn Abd-Din in his Hashiyat al-Radd al-Muhtar, and mentions that obviously that he transmitted some of these أقوالs عن الحدادي صاحب الجوهرة وأنه أجاب عنها سراج الدين الهاملي رواية عن شيخه علي ibn Nuh. And so in this case, that the transmission is done through Siraj al-Din al-Hamili, who transmits these views from his Shaykh Ali ibn Nuh. So this is one of those rare cases where you actually see that the nuanced views of these scholars held sway in not only in the circles of studies, but also in the literature that was spread through. Another case study, and I'll be concluding with this one after I talk about the literature that's found in the Horn. Sayyidi, how long do I've got left? It's now 7:45. Are you there? I'm just going to continue there. Hopefully I've got plenty of time. So with one of the influential Hanafis from the Horn is, as another case study, Sheikh Abi Hanifa. Abi Hanifa is Subhanallah, yeah, I could do with 10 minutes, that's good. Abi Hanifa Abdul Karim al-Razi al-Zaylaʿī, who also died was alive circa 720 Hijri, which is 1320 CE, is one of those amazing cases where every biographical layer gives you a little bit of details about him, but not enough. And so Abi Hanifa Abdul Karim al-Razi al-Zaylaʿī was a prominent Hanafi faqih from Zaylaʿ. Many of the biographies where they constantly repeat that is that he was very eloquent, fasihan, despite being an ajam, despite being a foreign tongue. Despite being a person who basically doesn't fluently speak, or maybe has a problem with speaking and pronouncing Arabic words. So that might have been an issue. But nonetheless, Abu Hanifa al-Zaylaʿī was known by the honorific of Abu Hanifa because of his deep engagement with and a mastery of the Hanafi school of law. And this is a kunya and or name that they have given him because the extensive amount of knowledge that he held on the madhab. He knew the intrinsics of the madhab, especially the early views of the madhab, as well as the late scholarship. And he traveled extensively. He traveled to Yemen, he traveled to Shām, he traveled to Hijaz as Hajj. He taught these places many individuals. And so among the many that he taught, and most illustrious were Ibrahim Abu Ishaq ibn Umar ibn Alawi. And this is an Alawi scholar of Yemen who basically was very influential himself, who taught many scholars in the Horn of Africa and spread Hanafism. So he eventually returned to his home country, to Zaylaʿ, to advance and continue teaching. And this is really important element because many times you see that obviously these scholars who travel to the Middle East, they stay put. They don't really go further. They don't go back, and some do, but they don't go back most of the times. And so this is one of those cases where a scholar that came from Zaylaʿ or from the Horn of Africa, who basically did whatever he's able to do in terms of gain and give, that came back to Zaylaʿ and continue the tradition of teaching the locality that he came from. And this is really important because that tells us whatever he learned and knew, he added to his treasure. He actually came back with it, and then he basically spread it through the people he came. And we know through later periods, and I'm skipping quite a lot here because I don't want to touch on Cairo because that is we're going to be here all night otherwise, because the Cairo was a huge number of scholars that actually resided there. But if you look at early colonial period, late colonial period, you'll see that the famous Egyptian historian by the name of Abdurrahman al-Jabarti in his famous books mentions that when he's talking about his ancestors and where he's from, that he came from Jabart, which was the land of Zaylaʿ, as known as land of Zaylaʿ. So it's comprised several towns and regions, which was inhabited by different people of different ethnicities. And he says they follow only the Hanafi and Shafi'i madhab. So essentially, basically talking about that even as late as 13th century Hijri and early 19th century, that shows you that the madhab was dominant. Both madhabs were dominant in the Horn of Africa. But specifically, what we see is that the dominance of the madhab stays in specifically in Eritrea, for example, where the Qadi al-Qudat was for the most part an Hanafi, who is a prominent Hanafi actually till late Ottoman period, by a student of his name was I think Mukhtar Ibrahim, who was a student of the late Mufti of the Ottoman period, Imam Muhammad Zahid al-Kawthari, and who studied with him and who had a lot of ijazat from Muhammad Zahid al-Kawthari, rahmatullah alayh. And then so this is you can see that the madhab spread. And so Abdurrahman al-Jabarti, coming back to him, you can see from his father also. His father was a great Hanafi scholar who debated a lot in Al-Azhar. He was an Azhari, He was the Sheikh al-Azhar. He wrote various volumes on Hanafi fiqh. One of my favorite one is the zakat and how to measure, how to basically calculate zakat al-fitr, or just general zakat in the Hanafi madhab and weighing it. And he wrote an amazing book on scales. So moving on to the Hanafi text in the Horn of Africa, which is amazing in of itself, because you would have thought, okay, predominantly all we know in the Horn of Africa now, as it stands, is Shafi'ism, and therefore we would just not see much of Hanafism in there. And so just by collating books and looking at the manuscripts that are available in people's households, in masajids, in private collections, you could see that Hanafism, whether that would be through the Aqidah work, the Maturidi works, like for example here in Mogadishu, in the just before the Civil War, in the library there was an early makhtut copy available that was copied over in Mogadishu of this famous Maturidi text called عقود العقائد في فنون الفوائد by the Hanafi scholar Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr Imam al-Zada. It's just a popular Aqidah text. But also you could see through the Riyadh Mosque collection, and that link, you could just visit it. It's a wealth treasure of data, because if you look at the fiqh section alone, the manuscripts that are available just from one mosque, Riyadh Mosque of Lamu, Kenya. If you look at that alone, you will find overwhelming number of fiqh text comes from Hanafi fiqh, not Shafi'i fiqh. It outnumbers the Shafi'i fiqh textbook. And you will think, what is that? Because, you know, Kenya today, the Islam that is practiced is for the most part 99.9% according to the Shafi'i madhab. Now, the reason that this is, some scholars have said, is because, you know, the diversity of the communities that are there, the Hanafi community that are there, usually from the subcontinent, and people who come actually to trade. But that's not always the case, as we've been talking about earlier on, and showing that if you just wear the hat of saying, oh, okay, because, you know, because there are people from the subcontinent living and part of the community, therefore, you know, Hanafism equivalent Hanafism. That's not necessarily the case if you look at the data and the material that we were just talking about, and how rich that cultural, how rich that literature, Hanafi literature, is in the Horn of Africa. So as I have calculated and listed, because I have a long list of, I went through all the kutub in that, all the manuscripts and makhtudat in that list, and I've noted down all of the titles of Hanafi fiqh, their datings and their time periods, and who copied them and where it was copied and stuff. You could actually yourself see it from that collection, which is really impressive. Another collection is also rich on data, Hanafi manuscripts, Hanafi authors, is the one that's known as Islam in the Horn of Africa, a comparative literature approach. So this project is primarily hosted there on that platform. It's very hard to get access to it. Some of you listening here, please let me know if you ever get into it. It's one of those places where you think, okay, this is private club type of thing. But yeah, the project is basically a collection of manuscripts that's been collated around the Horn of Africa, meaning Ethiopia, Djibouti, Eritrea, and Somalia. And these manuscripts that were in private. And then also these manuscripts, also some other manuscripts that were housed in different parts of the world. And so if you look at the Hanafi section, and as I put the link there, Hanafi says, and you look at it, you will see either a lot of the writers and copyists were from Hanafi background, and so they're copying that over with their statements that they are from there, or you basically say, oh, okay, these are Hanafi books and Hanafi texts. Again, substantial amount of, I think, over 60 material or books are from this Hanafi scholarship and Hanafi scholars. And this is a whopping huge number, looking at how much of the Horn of Africa today, again, once more, are known to be Shafi'i. So, and these are all mostly some recent books. Not all of them are old. Some are old, but you know, most of them are most recent, maybe the last 2 centuries. And so it's mind-boggling to see that amount of material. And yes, the Hanafi madhab is still followed in what is today Eritrea, what is today Djibouti, and maybe partially Djibouti, not so much in Somalia. And the Somalis are actually the largest ethnic group in terms of, as a Muslim and Shafi'is, they are the largest group of people, ethnic group of people in the Horn of Africa. So they are the exception out of that body. But it's not been always the case as prior to that, as Ibn Khaldun tells us that as Ibn Battuta tells us, that most of these people in Somali coast tend to be Shafi'is during the time that he came, but also Hanafis in terms of the madhab that was followed by the different rulers and different qadis. Anyway, I want to keep, inshallah, bi'idhnillah kareem, to that for this session, bi'idhnillah kareem bari. Anybody who wants to dig into, Allah musta'an, the sources that we use, please let me know. They're available here at the end of the slides, inshallah, bi'idhnillah kareem. I think there's around, I think, there's a good number of bibliography to consult, bi'idhnillah kareem bari. I'm concluding with this, barakallahu fikum, with the last statement to say that this is just a window of specific period in the Horn of Africa as it translates to the heritage of the Hanafi scholars in the Horn of Africa, but also in Yemen. So we could do another one on the Hijaz, those scholars who came to the Hijaz, who debated with the Shafi'is, specifically Ibn Hajar al-Haytami. Ibn Hajar al-Haytami was the epitome of Shafi'ism in his era in Mecca. And also we have Hanafis from al-Zaylaʿī who debated him on the final point of Hanafism versus Shafi'ism, which is an amazing anecdote. That we have the similar thing on scholars that was established in Shām, in Dimashq, and places like Halab. And you have also people who actually overwhelmingly established themselves in Cairo. Cairo was literally the center and the hub of Hanafism and Shafi'ism in the Mamluk era, which basically gave us all these rich sources that we are citing from today. And that's why we see those sources date from 650s Hijri till early 9th century Hijri, because of the Mamluk effort in the Islamic literature and Islamic heritage and the spread of it. Jazakumullah khairan wa jaza. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I'll pass the mic to Sayyidi Sheikh Tabriz.